Going to bring up Gary Mann. Gary's going to be our next speaker. Gary, come on up. He's the head of Professional Indemnity and Cyber Liability, and I can't wait for you to hear from him.
Thank you, Teresa.
See you, Gary.
Thank you very much. Wow, I gotta say, I just had a flashback to my kids' grade school career night back, where I got to follow the firefighter. So in this case, Teresa, you're like the astronaut, so thank you very much for that. Right, so I'm Gary Mann. I'm the North American head of Professional Liability and Cyber Liability for Allianz. And not to scare you further, but I would like to start off with a quote. This is from General Keith Alexander, who's the former head of the NSA. Quote, "The loss of industrial information and intellectual property through cyber espionage constitutes the greatest transfer of wealth in history." I just want to pause on that for a moment. This is coming from the NSA, specifically from Keith Alexander. This is not an individual or an organization known for hyperbole. So I want to put this all in perspective. We are seeing the level of threats we're seeing now and the level of losses are not something we've seen in the past. To put in perspective, the 2018 Allianz Risk Barometer identified, in my opinion, correctly that cyber, and particularly business interruption related to cyber breaches, constituted the greatest threat we have in 2018, and that's mirrored into 2019. So let's break this down. So when we talk about cyber breaches, what are we talking about? What is this? So in 2016 and 2017, we've seen over a 50% increase in cyber breaches over that period of time. We've seen a 50% increase in ransomware growth. Over 6 billion records have been breached. And fully 60% of those breaches were aimed at small and medium businesses, okay? So let's see what's behind this. So per the 2018 IBM Global Data Breach Cost Study, $3.9 million is the average cost of a data breach. That cost goes to $7.9 million per breach in the US. Of each breach, the average cost of a lost piece of information is $148 per record. In the United States, that's $152. To put it in perspective, there is some scale of economies here. So as we look at smaller accounts, per record cost and loss is much higher than we get with the larger accounts. So if we're looking at an account that has a breach of maybe 10,000 records, that's where we see the highest costs per record. That's where you see the $152 per record. As we go down the scale, and we get to 100,000 records or more that are lost, you know, of course the loss itself is more expensive, but the scales are much smaller. So you might see a much smaller cost per record. Year over year, we're seeing an average increase of losses by 6.4%. So if you're compounding that along with the loss, you can see where we're going with that. The most shocking thing to me is, once there's been a breach, within 2 years, there's a 28% chance of another material breach. So if you have a client who's been breached, most likely they're going to get breached again. In the US, that goes to 27%. So figure about 28% chance that there's going to be a second breach within 2 years. Again, this is reflective of the size of the account. So if we're looking at an account or a risk that has perhaps 10,000 records breached, they're at the high end of the scale of probability. If we look at something where the account has 100,000 records or more breached, then that percentage goes down to maybe 15%. I mean, this is really reflective of the accounts themselves. Perhaps, an underwriter in me wants to convince myself this has to do with the account itself. Perhaps, the business owners don't really want to spend the entire money that is required to increase it, or it's something else. Maybe it has to do with the larger accounts. Either way, the average time to identify an incident per IBM is 197 days. Teresa says 211. And Teresa, I'll get back to IBM and let them know to edit their numbers. However, the average time to contain that is 69 days. 69 days. So we'll get to that in a moment. If there's a cyber incident response team, that can be brought down by 30 days. And per IBM study, if they shorten that period of time by 30 days, that's $1 million saving by average on a breach. So just some things to think about. So if we're looking at the average cost, or the cost to the industry and the world as a whole, In 2015, the then chairman of Lloyd's said worldwide there's a $400 million loss from cyber breaches, $400 million. As we go forward exponentially, we've seen that increase. So by 2021, the industry is predicting that there will be a $6 billion in total loss. $6 billion. So even more alarming, there it is the cost, the outlays going from the cybersecurity from our clients to present those. So you can see exponentially as the costs go up for losses, there is a growth in security, but not quite as the same. The Verizon breach investigations report, which is a lengthy, quite a lengthy report that comes in annually, was addressing this specifically, and there was a quote there that really caught my attention. It went something like this: most attacks are opportunistic and target not the wealthy and famous, but the unprepared. So keep that in mind as we're looking at the accounts and we're looking at the small versus large, and their profiles for each, the profiles for their information, the profiles for their data. So as we look at this, and you're to ask me the 3 things that any account can do to immediately improve their cyber profile now, there are basically 3 things. Implement a cyber response team. That's identify them, deploy them, train, drill. The second is extensive use of encryption. That includes 2FA, as Teresa was indicating. And lastly, people. So as Teresa said earlier, people are often identified as weak links. So train them and build awareness programs. And before I leave, I'll let you know that there is a very large payment processor I'm familiar with. And they have awareness programs and they have training programs, as much of us do. But they actively phish their employees. They actively phish them. And if an employee were to click on the link, it does 2 things. The link reports them to the cybersecurity team, but it also immediately directs them to training, which I thought was rather humorous on my side, but it's effective. It's a novel way to approach the awareness and deliver training at the same time.